Hello again. Thank you for having me back. Shabbat Shalom. I hope everyone's enjoying a nice meal and companionship. Again, as we celebrate the 290th anniversary of Congregation Mickve Israel. So in the sanctuary, I tried to paint a picture or portrait, brief portrait, of how this congregation and this community fits into the larger story of the Sephardic saga, or the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. And so what I'd like to do in this presentation is to take a macro perspective, if we will, to go back, beginning about 3,000 years, to the Iberian Peninsula, to what may be the origins of Jewish life there, and to go forth across great expanses of time and space, to bring back closer to the present day, so that we, again, understand this incredible legacy of which Mickve Israel forms a part. So again, starting from here and going back. Whence comes the term Sefarad? We know that Jews from Spain and Portugal are called Sephardic Jews, but where does that term come from? It appears in the Tanakh, or parts of the biblical canon, in this book, Obadiah, which is one of the 12 minor prophets in Jewish history. And there's a verse that makes a reference to a rather ambiguous location, Sefarad. It's not clear from the context alone where it is, but from antiquity, Jewish tradition strongly came to identify this place, Sefarad, with the Iberian Peninsula, with the countries of Spain and Portugal. And so situating ourselves geographically, if you can see the map here, the Iberian Peninsula is shaded in green. It forms the westernmost appendage of Europe, and it is situated at the confluence of countries, cultures, and civilizations. It's bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on its west and northwest. It's separated from France by the Pyrenees mountain range, and it's bordered to its east by the Mediterranean basin or sea. And at its very southern extremity, it is separated from Morocco, and hence Africa, by a narrow body of water known as the Strait of Gibraltar. And then on the left is a zoomed up image of the Iberian Peninsula. Spain, of course, comprises the vast majority of it in this darker green or turquoise color, and Portugal, the smaller western neighbor in the lighter green, abuts the Atlantic Ocean. And so when did Jews come to the Iberian Peninsula? When did they arrive in the biblical Sefarad? Well, it's quite likely to believe they arrived as early as the time of the First Temple, nearly 3,000 years ago. Although not conclusively proven, we know from history, and again parts of the historical record, that King Solomon, who constructed the first temple in Jerusalem, had an extremely close relationship with King Hiram, who was the Phoenician king of Tyre, located in what is now modern-day Lebanon. Again, this is the unified kingdom of Israel under Solomon, and the light purple kingdom, or statelet, which is next to the Mediterranean, is the kingdom of Phoenicia. So they're very close and proximate to one another, and the Tanakh says that Hiram sent workers and craftsmen who felled the great cedars of the Lebanon to aid in the construction of the first temple. And we know that the Phoenicians were a great seafaring peoples. And being expert mariners, they traversed the entire length and breadth of the Mediterranean basin. They established trading centers, settlements, and cities across, you can see the Levant, which would be the modern-day countries of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, up into Turkey, across North Africa, and even into southern Europe, into Sicily, Sardinia, and they came to Spain and Portugal. Tradition holds that the Phoenicians actually founded the very cities of Cadiz and Malaga in Spain, and Lisbon, or Lisboa, in Portugal. And so because of the alliance between Israel and Phoenicia, the relationship between Solomon and Hiram, scholars have concluded it's likely that at least a Jewish presence arrived as early as the 10th century BCE, or about 3,000 years ago. But again, that's speculation. It's not historically verified. What we find from the documentary record from primary sources is that there was well-established Jewish communal life in Spain and likely Portugal about 2,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Common Era during the time of the Roman Empire. Three primary sources which shed light on this are the New Testament, which of course depict the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and it also showcases the travels of the Apostle Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, who underwent his conversion to Christianity on the famous road to Damascus. And he preached the gospel of Jesus' messiahship to Jew and Gentile alike throughout the Mediterranean, in this first century Greco-Roman Mediterranean world. And he says in his epistle to the Romans explicitly that he wished to venture as far west as Spain to preach the gospel. And so again, this is indirect evidence there were likely Jewish communities already in Spain by the first century of the Common Era. A generation after Paul is the noted Jewish historian Josephus, an eyewitness to the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70 CE. And Josephus says in his work that following the destruction of the Second Temple, the Romans exiled that remnant of Jews from the southern kingdom of Judah, which comprised the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, into Europe and Asia, in the lands under their domination and occupation, and this included Spain or Hispania. A third interesting, rather tantalizing source of information comes to us from the Babylonian Talmud, a compendium of rabbinic rulings and sayings seeking to explicate perceived ambiguities in the written text of the Hebrew Bible. Right? Often the Hebrew Bible referred to as the Torah Shebechtav, right? And the Talmud referred to as the oral Torah, the Torah Shabbal Peh, and there are explicit references in some of these tractates to Spain, Hispania, and Cordoba. And so again, by the first few centuries of the Common Era, this documentary source record leads us to conclude there must have been vibrant, prosperous Jewish communal life well known across the Mediterranean as far as Babylon or modern-day Iraq. Archaeologically, it's a bit more sparse. A legendary tombstone bearing the epitaph of Adoniram, a treasurer of King Solomon, was unearthed in medieval times. But the first verified gravestone unearthed was that of a young girl named Salo, dated to about the 3rd century CE. So again, it confirms the documentary hypothesis, if you will. And it says in the epitaph in Latin that she was about 3 or 4 years old when she died, and it mentions Judea, that she was, again, of Jewish origin. Around this same time, we see the very first issuance of what might be regarded as officially sanctioned anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. This came at an ecclesiastical council or church synod in about the year 305 in Elvira, which is by modern-day Granada. And again, it testifies to the modern-day city of Granada in the south of Spain. And it testifies to the, again, extensive relationship and interaction that must have existed between Jews and Christians, because the canons tell us that marriage is prohibited between Jews and Christians. Christians are forbidden from observing Saturday as the Sabbath, as the Shabbat. Jews are prohibited from blessing Christian crops, and they are forbidden from breaking bread together. Now, under Roman rule, Jewish life, at least in the diaspora, certainly in Spain and Portugal, was relatively tolerant, relatively good. But as Rome contracted, as the Roman Empire gradually fell, in the West at least, until it collapsed in 476 CE, right, Germanic tribes, the so-called barbarian invasions, came in and they conquered these far-flung outlying provinces or peripheries of the Roman Empire. And in Spain, or Iberia, the Visigoths came to conquer this Iberian peninsula, known as Visigoths, Western Goths. They initially espoused a non-Trinitarian Christian creed based on the teachings of the Bishop Arius, known as Arianism, not to be confused with another term like that. Yeah, I know. This creed permitted them to be relatively tolerant of other Christians and Jews. In 587, however, King Ricard, who's seen here, famously converted from Arianism to Catholicism in an attempt to unify church and state. And almost immediately, anti-Jewish measures are taken. Legislation is promulgated at this council in Toledo. And it got even worse that by 613, Ricard's successor, King Sisebutt, ordered the full-scale conversion or expulsion en masse of all Jewish communities in the Visigothic realm. So again, throughout Spain, Portugal, and it's estimated this ultimatum affected as many as 90,000 Jews. Again, we're talking the early 7th century. So 90,000 Jews who either converted to Catholicism, at least nominally, so again, they became crypto-Jews, if you like, or they fled to France or North Africa. By the middle of the 7th century, the great law code of the Visigoths, the Lex Visigothorum, was promulgated, and it's come down to us. It's heralded as a great code of laws, and in a way it did unify and structure things, but the stamp of its anti-Jewish animus is apparent. It tells us, quote, "For while we have extirpated all other heresies, we lament that the soil of our kingdom is still defiled by the infamy of the Jews, and we decree our edicts against them shall forever be inviolate." And so in a refrain that unfortunately was neither the first nor the last time in history, they prohibit Jews from observing core rituals, circumcision or Brit Milah, kashrut or dietary laws, and observing the Sabbath or Shabbat. The most significant clause of this code, however, is that it changes what Jewishness means. It says, quote, "Jews, whether baptized or not baptized, are forbidden to testify in court." And so this so-called racialization of religion, again, at the middle of the 7th century, means Judaism ceased to be viewed by the outside society as a profession of faith, and Jewishness, whatever this is, comes to be seen as something innately biological, something that's transmitted by blood, by descent. And baptism, this ritual, can never efface whatever the Jewish taint, in a way, is. And so the forcible conversions of those tens of thousands of Jews during the reign of Sefarad creates a quandary, creates an entirely new class or category of persons. Thousands, tens of thousands of people who are nominally Catholic, but secretly, in many cases, practicing Judaism. And so they come to be known as new Christians, to distinguish them from the old Christians. They come to be called Cristianos Nuevos in Spanish or Cristãos Novos in Portuguese in later times. And effectively synonymous terms that some of you may be familiar with are Marranos, Anusim, Conversos, or crypto-Jews. But again, the very phenomenon of crypto-Judaism is effectively born in the mid-7th century. Visigothic rule came to an end in 711 when Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from Morocco. They conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula within a few short years, as you can see within the green. So they conquered effectively all of Portugal, most of Spain. And the Christian and Muslim sources say that the Jewish communities, at least the remnant that still remained, aided the rapidity of the conquest. Certainly they could only have seen the Muslim advance as a type of salvation from the Visigothic persecution. And they assisted Muslims so much that Muslims left the defense of key cities in the south of Spain, in Granada, in Cordoba, in Carmona, in Seville or Sevilla, again, cities associated with the biblical Sefarad, in the hands of the Jewish community. And as you can see, the Christian kingdoms in the north are disunited and just petty principalities. And so as a result of the Muslim conquest of 711, this gives rise to the famous so-called Golden Age of Sefarad, or Sephardic Judaism, which is, of course, still looked upon very much, quite fondly. And it finds its fullest, I'd say, cultural brilliance or flowering in the 200 years from the 10th to the 12th century under the Umayyad Caliphate. And it's really marked by the spirit of so-called convivencia, of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living with, working with one another in relative amity and harmony in various fields or disciplines of human endeavor, in art and architecture and history and poetry and philosophy and astronomy, all searching for a truth common to them all. This isn't to say that persecution never happened. It wasn't a true paradise, but certainly it was vis-a-vis other locations. It's a remarkable period. And of course, a number of extraordinary individuals emerge in this time period, including Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who served as the foreign minister or vizier to the caliph. We have a biblical commentator, Abraham ibn Ezra, who's still, his research or his comments are still cited in biblical study. We also have, of course, the towering figure of the age, who came at the very end of it, so an incredible tribute, that of Maimonides. The Rambam, or Moses ben Maimon, who's born in Cordoba, who became a scholar, legal codifier, philosopher, and was, of course, a noted physician. Compelled to flee by religious fanaticism, he wound up in Egypt, in Cairo, where he became the personal physician to the Egyptian Sultan Saladin. And again, his two great works of his Mishneh Torah, his great code of Jewish law, and his Moreh Nevuchim, or his guide for the perplexed, an attempted synthesis of reason and faith in his own time, are still read and admired to this day. And so just to show you, ladies and gentlemen, you can see Jewish presence, Jewish life was to be found in city, town, and village across Spain and Portugal. In Madrid, the capital of Spain, and Barcelona in the northeast, and Saragossa, in Valencia, in the biblical Sefarad in Andalusia, Seville, Carmona, Granada, Cordoba. In Portugal, Lisbon, the capital, right, that the Phoenicians founded. In the northwest, we have Porto, we have Coimbra, we have Tomar. They're to be found everywhere. Well, after the death of Maimonides, after the end of this golden age, the Umayyad Caliphate had collapsed. The Islamic kingdom essentially fragmented into competing statelets. The Christian kingdoms in the north reunified, and they gradually pushed Muslim forces back, reconquering much of the territory they had lost in 711. And this process is known as the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain. And so again, you can just see that by the 12th, early 13th century, right after the death of Maimonides in 1204, really the only soil, the only part of the Iberian Peninsula that Muslims still hold is the Kingdom of Granada in the south of Spain. And while there were some enlightened Christian rulers in this process who did believe that Jews could contribute to society, including notably Alfonso X, El Sabio, Alfonso the Wise, who actually styled himself king of the three religions of the Abrahamic faiths, after his death, we see a marked deterioration in the situation of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. And it's truly exemplified by the 14th century, by the 1300s. The Black Death came in the mid-1300s, around 1350, the most fatal pandemic in human history, killing between an estimated 30 to 60% of the entire European population. And I'm sure many of you know, Jewish communities across the continent are scapegoated, vilified, massacred. Centuries-old communities are wiped out overnight. And this assault, this rioting, this violence reached the Iberian Peninsula, particularly the city of Barcelona, leaving but a remnant of survivors for an even greater assault and tragedy which was to occur in 1391. That summer witnessed an outbreak of violence and bloodshed, the likes of which had never been seen, from the Pyrenees in the northeast to the Straits of Gibraltar in the south, from the border of Portugal in the west to the island of Majorca, the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands of Jews are slain. Scores of individuals composing every strata of society are put to the sword. And as you can see, some of these figures, about 4,000 Jews in Seville, the entire community, are killed. Less than 10% of Jews in Valencia escape either death or forcible conversion. And even as notable figure as Solomon Halevi, the chief rabbi of Burgos, ends up converting to Catholicism. And he actually ends up becoming archbishop of the same city. But again, perhaps the most significant part of this is that not only are tens of thousands of Jews slain, but even more end up converting to Catholicism. They throng to the baptismal fonts to save their lives and those of their children. And so this only exacerbates the question as to the religious identity of these new Christians. Who are they? Are they genuine Catholics? Are they secretly practicing Judaism? And so by 1391, as we enter the 1400s, Spanish Jewry is but a shell of its former self. And so by 1415, it's been estimated that 1/3 of Iberian Jewry had been forcibly converted to Catholicism, 1/3 had been slain, and 1/3 remained as openly professing Jews. In 1435, the Jews of Majorca and the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean are forcibly converted en masse, and this occurs repeatedly. In 1449, conversos, not openly professing Jews, but conversos, like Dr. Nunez and his family, are targeted for the first time. Discrimination is sanctioned by law in the city of Toledo, and thus is born into law the concept of purity of blood, or racial purity, which of course is eerily foreshadowing something worse. But again, this notion that Jewishness is something that is defined by blood, something that's passed down from generation to generation, something that it doesn't matter how many generations have passed since the initial baptism. And this comes to permeate society, this belief. Conversos had risen rapidly in society, shorn of sanctions or restrictions they may have possessed as professing Jews. They become very successful in business and government and in the armed forces, even in the church itself. And so they're barred from holding official positions on the basis of having Jewish ancestry. In 1473, the Jewish community was massacred in Cordoba. In 1476, they were expelled from Gibraltar. And all of this persecution of Jews and conversos, or new Christians, comes to a head with the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, which was established by papal decree by Pope Sixtus IV to definitively engage with this question of religiosity of new Christians. It's time to ferret out who is a genuine Catholic and who is not. And so again, established in 1478, inquisitors are appointed in 1480, and they set to work almost immediately. In the 1480s alone, the Inquisition's first decade of existence, over 700 of these conversos are burnt at the stake. In the south of Spain alone, 5,000 have their goods or property confiscated. And one scholar notes that from 1480, when the Inquisition really sets to work, until 1492, when Spanish Jewry is officially expelled, as we'll see, the Inquisition uncovered at least 13,000 forced converts, or crypto-Jews. That's what the records show us. So as Bayer says, these were men and women attached to their ancestral faith and people, so undoubtedly the real number must have been much higher. Now, there have been previous inquisitions in history. There was a medieval inquisition, there's a Roman Inquisition that infamously tries Galileo for heresy later on. But what distinguishes the Spanish and then the Portuguese Inquisition is really, I think, twofold. One is the scope and time and space. Again, this persecution, this obsession with ferreting out crypto-Jews, obviously other groups get caught up in it, but there is a pathological obsession with this particular type of heresy. It endures for 3.5 centuries on 5 continents. It goes into the time of Dr. Nunez, as we talked about earlier. This is why he and his family and other Portuguese new Christians had to flee. And looking at the records of the Spanish Inquisition, 99.3% of all suspects before the Spanish Inquisition in Barcelona in 1505 are of Jewish descent. And even as late as 1530, 50 years after the Inquisition's established, 40 years after the expulsion of Jews, over 90% of all suspects are of Jewish origin. Now, for the Inquisition, when they would arrest someone, there was no presumption of innocence like we have today. There was a presumption of guilt that would immediately attach. And so they had to obtain a confession because in their eyes, in canon law, the sin of heresy is the most grievous sin. It's a mortal sin. Puts the immortal soul in jeopardy. And the only possible way to avert that is to confess and gain absolution. And so confession comes to be known as the Queen of Proofs, the Regina Probatianum. They'll stop at nothing to obtain a confession if need be. And so proceedings are infamously kept secret. The accused is never permitted to know the identity of the witnesses or accusers against them, let alone confront them. Their property or goods are confiscated, depending on how long they're jailed, but that could last for weeks, months, even years. It's not unknown that cases were never resolved. The person languished in jail for decades. And of course, if they died as a heretic, the property would be confiscated by the state. And of course, they're tortured if need be to extract a confession. Now, Certainly, it's not to the level that we imagine in popular consciousness. Not every single person's being brutally tortured. But we know that they occur, and three of the most infamous methods are the garrucha or strappado, which is this pulley-based system. As you can see, the individual will be hoisted with his arms tied behind his back, lifted up with heavy weights attached and dropped, which could dislocate limbs. We have toka, the water torture, or waterboarding in modern parlance, where, of course, the person will be strapped to a board, a cloth inserted into their mouth, water poured copiously down their throats, simulating drowning. And we have the potro, or the rack, which is by far the most common method utilized according to records. And as you can see, the individual will be strapped to this device, ropes tied tightly around their limbs. Individual operating the lever would rotate it so that eventually the rope could generate sufficient force to break through skin, muscle, veins, sinew, and eventually crush the bones themselves. And this all culminates in the so-called auto de fe, or act of faith. This is a famous painting by Francisco Goya, housed in the Prado Museum in Madrid, I believe, to this day. And as you can see, the individual would be formally judged at this time. It could be in private, it could be in public, and that's certainly the image we have in popular consciousness. But this would be the formal ceremony to judge the heretic, followed by a punishment. Now, we have to note that the three sentences which were possible are the accused could be acquitted, virtually never happened. They could be penanced, which is the vast majority of sentences, meaning they have to undergo some type of punishment, whether that is having property permanently confiscated, whether that's being lashed, being imprisoned for a term of years, or going on pilgrimage, etc., whatever the church decided. And lastly, especially for the repeat or unrepentant heretics, so the stalwart group of people who refuse to see the light, they are to be relaxed. And that's just a euphemism for handing them over to the secular arm or authority to be burnt at the stake. And as you can see here, the accused also is to wear what is known as a San Benito. This is an outer garment draped over their clothing, which would often have their name, social status inscribed, and there was a symbol associated with the crime they're charged with. So in heresy, it would be flames, because of course everyone knew they would be consigned to the flames of hell. And of course, these are depictions of being burnt at the stake. This, just to show, is the magnificent, and I hate to use that word, but it is a magnificent painting of course, the most dreadful event. And this is the Grand Auto de Fe of 1680, which occurred in the Plaza Mayor of Madrid, in the central square. This is the king and the queen in the central balcony, so it's graced by the presence of royalty. We have the Grand Inquisitor here. We have other high-ranking dignitaries and officials. We have families of the accused, officers, etc. It's a who's who, effectively. And if you look here, there's a second story. This is the story that had to be built on top of the ground floor. This probably drew 30 to 50,000 people to witness. These are faceless forms. These are people underneath. And these two guys in the middle are the condemned. They're wearing those San Benitos with the flames, and they're kidding, they're going to be burnt. And they're wearing these, and I should have mentioned before, they're wearing these carrozas, dunces hats, conical caps in order to further humiliate them in the eyes of the public. And it's meant to really inspire a type of day of judgment atmosphere and reaffirm the faith of the faithful. This is the situation which lasted, or which we arrive in 1492. Catholic forces finally conquered the last bastion of Islamic control in the Kingdom of Granada, the city of Granada, in the south of Spain in January of that year. As this, again, this really detailed and very nice painting suggests, the Catholic forces were led by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, and so 800 years of Islamic rule comes to an end. And as Ben-Zion Netanyahu, a very famous scholar on the Inquisition and the father of the current Prime Minister of Israel, notes, after this happened, what would happen to the Jews? As he puts it, a strange peace prevailed, but it was the calm before the storm. When the edict of expulsion was announced, it came like a thunderbolt out of the clear sky, tumbling the walls of illusions behind which the Jews of Spain had lived. On the 31st of March of the same year, just a few months later, Ferdinand and Isabella their most royal highnesses and Catholic monarchs come to the Alhambra, a magnificent citadel and fortress located at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada, which is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they sign the Edict of Expulsion, or Alhambra Decree. Again, as it's signed in that building. And it's, you can see a copy of the edict. It's signed by the king and the queen, some other officials, embossed with the royal seal. And it orders the Jews be expelled from Spanish soil, all Spanish possessions, forevermore. As you can see, they only have at most 4 months to leave. We're talking 120 days to depart their ancestral homeland of 1,500 to 2,000 years. They are forbidden from taking gold, silver, or precious stones. And as news of the decree trickles out across the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the property values of Jews rapidly depreciates because everyone knows they're going to have to give them up. And also, synagogues, cemeteries, neighborhoods are all seized for the profit of the crown. How many Jews departed in 1492? Which, of course, in a way begins the story of Mickve Israel. Well, it's a matter of debate even now. Somewhere between 80,000 to 800,000 openly professing Jews remained. I mean, based on the historical record, and if past is prologue, I submit that it must have been on the lower end. But regardless, the consensus is that only half decided to leave. The other half converted to Catholicism in order to stay. And the expulsion edict 4 months later, corresponding to the end of July, although it was delayed a few days, to August 2nd, corresponds to, or just about on, to Sha B'Av, of 5252 or 1492, which is, of course, the great day of lamentation on the Jewish calendar, which commemorates all the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people throughout the ages. And this is where we see the beginnings of the Sephardic diaspora, a unity that has never been recovered. Half of the exiles, as I'll show you in a moment, they leave Iberia entirely. They go to North Africa, to Morocco principally. Others go to the Ottoman Empire, to the Eastern Mediterranean, including my own ancestors. Others stay on the Iberian Peninsula and enter Portugal, a neighboring kingdom, similar culture, climate, language, and of course very nearby. But this is an abrupt cataclysm in Jewish and really world history. And it's said that from the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, to which Josephus was an eyewitness, to the Shoah, which is still in our living memory, this was the greatest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people. There had been other expulsions, of course, in European history, from England in 1290, from France a couple or a few times in the 1300s, from various cities in the Holy Roman Empire, but again, nothing on the scale or scope of tens to hundreds of thousands of Jews being evicted in a mere matter of months from a place they had lived and contributed in for centuries, if not millennia. And this is the map. As you can see, the exiles went everywhere. Again, they crossed the Mediterranean, they went to Morocco, to North Africa. Others went to the Italian peninsula, to Italy. Others, of course, you can see to Egypt, to the land of Israel, to Lebanon and Syria. Others up into the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, again, my own ancestors. Others to Salonika or Thessaloniki in Greece, or Izmir, further up into the Balkans. And again, there's others, though, who stay, and they turn west into Portugal. And this, again, is where we see the branches emerge. You have North African Sephardim, Eastern Sephardim, right, those who go east, Western Sephardim, the ones who enter Portugal, and then you have Bnei Anusim, who are the descendants of the forced or coerced ones. Anusim is a Hebrew word for the connotation of you were forced. They were forced to convert against their will. And so these are people who are returning in our own time, in many cases, re-embracing Judaism, having learned they have Jewish ancestors. And these branches really constitute the story of Sefarad. Now, focusing on Portugal, because that is the history of this very congregation, half the Spanish Jews turn west, enter Portugal, and it's estimated the native Jewish population of Portugal, 1492, is around 30,000 people. Now, initially, they are accepted. They have to pay some type of tax or tribute to enter to King John or João II, but they are permitted to stay and worship according to their faith. John died in 1495, and his cousin and successor, Manuel, who's seen here, initially seemed benevolent. He allowed them to stay and worship freely as well. However, he sought to unify the Iberian Peninsula by marrying the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, you can imagine what the precondition was. Ferdinand and Isabella were not going to expel their own Jews to allow them to just cross the border near next door. So they mandate that Manuel has to expel the Jews from Portugal in order to have their daughter's hand in marriage. And he reluctantly acquiesces. In December of 1496, orders all Jews, Spanish refugees, and native Portuguese Jews alike to convert or leave Portugal by October of 1497. Now, at least officially, it's 10 months, not 4, which was given to Spanish Jewry. Manuel had misgivings. He realized in tens of thousands of Jews who had entered Portugal, they could be useful, provide great utility to the economy. And so in March, he orders Jewish children under 14 to be forcibly baptized, hoping that their parents will follow suit. And when this doesn't work, he then tries the carrot approach, and in May of 1497, he offers them this 20-year period of grace. He says, if you convert to Catholicism, we will not inquire into your religious beliefs or actions. We will not have an inquisition. This also doesn't work. So then he stumbles upon a rather ingenious and sinister idea, and he says, you know what, you can leave if you want, but you have to come to Lisbon, to the port, and I'll have ships waiting to take you where you want to go. And so sometime in May or probably June of 1497, about 20,000 Jews converge on the port of Lisbon, and there are no ships to be seen. You can probably imagine what happened. Manuel basically locks them in the square. The monks or Dominican friars likely immediately baptize them all. Throw baptismal water, so in minutes, effectively, there are no more Jews. The entire normative community is gone. They're all instantly Portuguese New Christians. So unlike Spain, there's never a choice given to the Portuguese New Christians. Manuel goes further. All synagogues and schools are closed. Religious paraphernalia, such as ritual objects and books, are confiscated. Cemeteries are even uplifted or destroyed. At least the order is given. We don't know if it actually happened. Manuel then prohibits these new Christians from leaving because he fears that if they leave, they'll just revert to Judaism. Well, and we can't have that. And so this has been described as a religicide, an attempted annihilation of a faith, and really it's a condemnation of Jewish memory, right? What we would call a damnatio memoriae. And by the end of the 15th century, Judaism as a living, breathing faith officially ceased to exist in the Iberian Peninsula, in the biblical Sefarad. Now, of course, this doesn't mean the Jews are gone. But the people of the book, the term which is usually applied to Jews, have to become people of memory. Remember, after the expulsion, after the forcible conversion, in Spain and Portugal, there are no more synagogues, schools, books, study halls, or rabbis. So I'm sorry about that, Rabbi Haas. Okay. Judaism became an oral transmission of knowledge, centered around the rituals of the home. Women are the traditional caretakers and, of the domicile, and thus they became the primary teachers and custodians of the tradition. The Inquisition was cognizant of this and came to focus to great effect upon women as mothers and daughters. In April 1506, so about 9 years after they're forcibly converted, everyone knew they were Jews in all but name. And around Easter, Passover, plague, and famine stalked the kingdom. And you can see in Lisbon, this is the Rocio Square, again, another main square of Lisbon. A massacre erupts, and it targets the new Christian community of Lisbon. Remember, there are no more openly professing Jews. And so 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians are dragged from their homes, killed, butchered there, or dragged to this Rocio Square and set in bonfires, which are set alight. Now, it's interesting to note that King Manuel did hang the clergy who were responsible for inciting the riot. And this has dramatic consequences because it reaffirms this idea that new Christians will forever be seen as the other. They'll forever be known as really Jews in all but name. And so the Inquisition, though, doesn't officially come to Portugal until 1536. So there's a huge gap. It comes in 1536, also published by papal decree. And the first auto de fe comes to Lisbon in 1540. Now, just as an aside, just to show you, I find this fascinating, what was the crypto-Jewish belief system? Again, openly converso or new Christian, secretly Jewish. We have to remember Spain and Portugal daily language and discourse, mental universe, the physical landscape is, again, permeated or replete with Catholic imagery. It's impossible to really be anything but a Catholic. And yet, almost all crypto-Jews in Spain and Portugal, and eventually their overseas colonies, it seems, according to inquisitorial records and other indicia or sources, cling to these 5 principles across time and space. The unity of the deity, God is one. A belief in the law of Moses. There is a requirement to observe the commandments, whatever that means. While there are multiple ways to reach God, Judaism is the preferred faith. And the 5th is the Messiah has not yet come. So again, these are all ideas, of course, embedded in normative Jewish theology. But again, they're effectively Catholics without faith and Jews without knowledge. They really are in a no man's land. And so in a way, the Inquisition defeats its own purpose, right? It sustains the very heresy of crypto-Judaism it's trying to get rid of. It expels Judaism, but not the Jews. Because the widespread societal discrimination exemplified by those limpiezas de sangre, the purity of blood statutes, and again, this widespread Catholic milieu, it really creates a group identity for these Portuguese New Christians, or conversos. They bond. They become known as members of the Portuguese nation, or homens de nação in Portuguese. And this title goes with them wherever they go. It's also why these synagogues are referred to as Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. In 1580, the Iberian Union is finally unified by Spain and Portugal under the Spanish King Philip II. And so the borders open. And so for the first time, really, these Portuguese New Christians are free to leave, free to flee. And thousands take advantage. They flee Iberia for Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and of course, eventually the New World. And so many leave that after 1580, when they're permitted to leave, to find a Portuguese living abroad becomes synonymous with the crypto-Jew or Judaizer. Famously, they go to Amsterdam, the great city in the north of Europe on the Amstel River. They arrive in around the 1590s. They're worshiping in their homes, very much like Mickve Israel. Eventually, in the 1615 or so, they establish an agreement, a modus vivendi, with the fledgling Dutch Republic, which has just become independent of Spain. And in 1639, the Sephardic community formally unifies. There were 3 competing synagogues as well over there. And as you can see, the famous Portuguese synagogue, known as the Asnoga in Amsterdam, was inaugurated eventually in 1675. And it is quite simply known in many places as the mother Portuguese synagogue of the world. 2 brief case studies. When conversos left, or Portuguese New Christians fled, what did they know of Judaism? Right? They were, again, shut off, cabined off from normative Judaism. They didn't have access to rabbinic tradition. And so this individual is quite fascinating. Uriel Acosta is born to a new Christian family in Porto, in Portugal. Eventually, he and his family leave for Hamburg and Amsterdam. But again, he's unfamiliar with normative Judaism. So he comes to these cities, he encounters rabbis, and they strike him as very much like Catholic clergy. He thinks they're corrupting the law of Moses. And so he challenges rabbinic authority. He's excommunicated several times. He tries to reconcile. He's forced to recant. He's publicly lashed, at least symbolically, in the synagogue in Amsterdam, as you can see in the painting. He goes home, he writes his autobiography, Exemplar Humanae Vitae, Example of a Human Life, and he commits suicide. A younger contemporary, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, is Baruch Spinoza, Latinized to Benedictus. He's the apogee of skepticism, certainly in the converso mind. Born in Amsterdam to converso parents who had reverted to the open practice of Judaism. He seems to have had a traditional Jewish upbringing, but he rejects established Jewish beliefs. And at the age of 24, he is formally excommunicated by the Amsterdam Jewish community. It's perhaps the most vehement, the most well-known, the harshest decree of excommunication ever issued in the history of Judaism. In July of 1656, if you can read it, it says, "By decree of the angels and command of the holy men, we excommunicate, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza for his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds." This is a copy, of course, of the excommunication writ, which is still preserved in the Amsterdam community. We don't know exactly what it was. He was only 24, but he later wrote a work, his Tractatus Theologico Politicus, detailing a lot of his quite revolutionary, unorthodox, quite literally views. He rejected the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the immortality of the soul, the obligatory or binding nature of the Torah upon future generations. He even comes to reject the very concept of a providential deity. As he puts it, Deus sive natura, God or nature. And unlike Oriel Acosta, he never sought reconciliation with the community, but he never converted to Christianity. Again, this is in the 1600s. And so for that reason, because he maintained some affinity with the Jewish people through a common kinship or origin, but not by faith, he has been referred to as history's first secular Jew. One of his teachers was Menashe ben Israel, born a Portuguese converso, Manuel Dias Soeiro, who moves to Amsterdam as a young boy, eventually becomes a leading rabbi in the community. Famous throughout Europe, he writes that work, Mickve Israel, in 1650, which sparks messianic fervor throughout the European continent. And he parlaying this fame, he goes to England, he meets with Oliver Cromwell, serving as Lord Protector, again of the English Commonwealth following the English Civil War. And he urges him to readmit Jews using a combination of religious and economic arguments. Oliver Cromwell doesn't officially readmit, but he doesn't forbid these Jews from entering. And so they come in about 1656. They return, they resettle for the first time since 1290. And of course, they found a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue relatively quickly. And King Charles II, when he is restored to the throne in 1660, permits the Jews to stay because Cromwell had never issued an edict. There's nothing to reverse. Also, perhaps a miracle in a way. And they are permitted to stay. They found that Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. Again, it moves to Bevis Marks, as this congregation well knows. And again, the congregation has still in existence, having held continuous services since 1701. Now, crossing the Atlantic, the Great Ocean Sea, coming to the New World, because again, this is, again, the very story of Mickve Israel. Where did they go? Well, crypto-Jews, we know from Luis de Torres, had arrived as early as 1492. And beginning with Columbus's voyage, thousands more come to the newly discovered Spanish and Portuguese possessions throughout the Western Hemisphere. And in Brazil, the Dutch briefly conquer part of Portuguese-held Brazil in the north, in Recife, in the state of Pernambuco. They only hold it for about 24 years, and yet something revolutionary happens. The Dutch governor, Johan Maurits, who's seen in this painting, permits the crypto-Jews to revert to Judaism. They build a synagogue, Kahal Sor Israel, so this is the very first synagogue in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And they grow to become about 1,500 members, about 10% of the European population of Recife, it's estimated. Amsterdam sends resources and personnel to assist in the growth of the community, including this Rabbi Isaac Aboab de Fonseca, who becomes the rabbi who thus holds the distinction of being the very first rabbi in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In 1654, Portugal reconquers Recife and gives the Dutch and the crypto-Jews, who are now openly professing Judaism, 3 months to leave. And there's 3 paths they take. They either stay in Brazil, they move much further into the interior of the continent, into the Sertão, where some of their descendants still remain to this day. Others cross the Atlantic, return to Europe, to Amsterdam, including Rabbi Isaac Aboab. Interestingly, he then presides over the excommunication of Baruch Spinoza 2 years later. So that's an interesting connection. And then famously, they island hop throughout the Caribbean. They go to Dutch and English colonies, to Barbados, Curacao, Dutch Guiana, now known as Suriname, and Jamaica. And of course, they eventually arrive all along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. From New York, even Montreal, Canada, Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, and right here. And all these synagogue names evoke a hope in the final redemption of the Jewish people. They are all plays on the name remnant, hope dispersed, or salvation of Israel. They're so integral, these new Christians, who become openly professing Jews once more, that even as notable figures Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence, notes that it was Portuguese Jews persecuted by the Inquisition, stripped of their fortunes, and banished to Brazil, who introduced the sugarcane and established the industry. And so you can see this converso circuit, really Sephardic Jewish circuit, whatever this is, whatever it means, it goes around the globe. As the academic Studimund Halevi notes, Sephardic Jewishness bridges the entire world. The Caribbean, it reaches across the Atlantic to Europe, to the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, to Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. It creates multiple and intersecting networks, underpinning this remarkable capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. And you can see on the map, by the way, the white arrows are the Spanish travels, and the blue are the Portuguese. And crypto-Jews are to be found everywhere. Conversos are traveling along with the Spanish and Portuguese, and so they are to be found on the east coast of South America, in Rio and Recife, and eventually in Africa, and Mozambique perhaps, in Goa, and Cochin in India, in Malacca in the Philippines, even Nagasaki in Japan. It's an incredible story. The Inquisition, let's not forget about them. They are cognizant and obviously fear greatly because this heresy is proliferating. And so what do? They establish tribunals in these colonies where the conversos are fleeing, trying to find religious freedom, or at least literally trying to put an ocean between themselves and the Inquisition. And so the Spanish establish a tribunal in Mexico City, which governs Mexico, New Mexico, Louisiana, Florida, right? Panama, and even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean. They established one in Lima, Peru, which governs South America until 1610, when they established another one in Cartagena, Colombia, to oversee Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean. And the Portuguese established a rather infamous, ruthless tribunal in Goa, India, to police the colonies in Africa and Asia. And then they empowered the bishop in Brazil, in Bahia, serving as the capital, to identify, extradite suspected heretics back to Lisbon to stand trial. And so this is a global reign of terror that again endures for 3.5 centuries on 5 continents. The geographical and generational scope of this persecution is unprecedented. From Brazil to Lisbon, from Manila to Mexico, thousands of people are extradited across oceans and continents to justify their religious beliefs. And many of these places have stories of crypto-Jews. Unfortunately, there's no time to get into it today, but they're martyred, effectively. They're burnt, they die as believing Jews, and some of their names are Luis de Carvajal Alamoso and Tomas Trevino de Sobremonte in Mexico City, who are burnt alive, Francisco Maldonado de Silva in Peru, who dies declaring, this is the doing of the God of Israel, so that I may meet him face to face, and Isaac de Castro Tardes, who with his dying words in Lisbon declares Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. By the late 18th century, there's a great liberalizing spirit in the air, and reforms are finally made to Portugal and later to Spain. Slavery is abolished, the auto de fe, and the racial purity laws that distinguish between the old and new Christians. And even as notable figure as Montesquieu, who goes on to influence the founders of the United States, declares in his great work, The Spirit of Laws, 1748, if anyone in times to come shall dare to assert that in the age in which we live, the people of Europe were civilized, you, meaning the Inquisition, will be cited to prove they were barbarians, and the idea they will have of you will dishonor your age. And so the framers of our republic, cognizant that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, enshrined religious freedom, really liberty of conscience, and a whole host of other procedural protections in the 1787 Constitution and in the 1791 Bill of Rights. In the end, it's estimated about 200,000 people stood trial before the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions over the course of its long history. And again, if we take into account anyone who had any interaction with the Inquisition, the number rises to an astonishing 1.5 million people. We don't know the real number, though, and likely never will. And yet, the history of the persecution literally remains in us, in our DNA. A 2008 study found that about 20% of Iberian men are descended from Sephardic Jews. An even more groundbreaking study in 2018, looking at people throughout Latin America, says that about 1 in 4 Latinos, or 25%, have Sephardic genetic ancestry. So this number, if you add it up, leads us to conclude there are about 200 million people around the world who are descended from Sefarad. The enduring effects of the Inquisition, it exported intolerance, it remade our world, it shattered the unity of Sefarad. The Inquisitions are only abolished relatively recently, 200 years ago. When Dr. de la Mata inaugurated this very congregation's first building in 1820, the Inquisition still existed. They ended in Portugal in 1821 and Spain in 1834. And the Edict of Expulsion, that 1492 Alhambra decree, is not formally rescinded until 1968. Of course, just to basically end, I have to show you a few photos. This is, of course, just yours truly in front in Madrid. This is the building where the Supreme Tribunal's headquarters, the Consejo Supremo, reigned for the last 40 years of its existence. How many sentences came forth condemning people for their beliefs from this relatively nondescript building? This is the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, the site of the Grand Auto de Fe of 1680. The apartments are the same, the balconies remain. People go there and eat and drink and have a lovely time, and I've been there and I've done it. And yet I think very few people are cognizant of the immense horrors and atrocities that occurred there centuries ago. In Lisbon, the municipality finally inaugurated a monument to the murdered New Christians of 1506. They did it in 2006 on the 500th anniversary. And this is in front of where the Inquisitional headquarters once stood, in the Rocio Square, in the place where the massacre happened. And this is just, of course, me in front of Congregation Mickve Tikva, which is the first synagogue built in Spain or Portugal since the time of the Inquisition. This was in 1904. And as you can see here, they're just monuments to the victims of the Inquisition and to the Holocaust. The two stand side by side. And this is just where the Jews once lived, in the street, the Jewish street. It still bears the name. And so ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, this is a call to remember, a call to bear witness. The Torah tells us no less than 170 times to remember. This is what, in a way, Judaism means. This is the command. Moses, in the end of Deuteronomy, near the end of his own life, enjoins our ancestors and us and every generation to remember. He says, Zechor yomot olam, binu shnot dor vador, shalavicha ve'yagedcha, zekeinecha ve'yomer lach. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations past. Ask your father and your mother, and they'll tell you, and your elders, and they will inform you. So I'd just like to conclude with this powerful quote by the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sacks, a man I once had the honor to meet. We did not come from nowhere, nor does our story end with us. We are letters in a long and still being written story, our chapters in a long and still being written story, a letter in the scroll of the book of the people of the book. Take it, cherish it, learn to understand and to love it, and pass it on to future generations, for you are a member of an eternal people. Let their eternity live on in you. And that is the mission of Jewish Heritage Alliance, to preserve, to research, to promote this incredible legacy of which Mickve Israel forms an incredibly vital part. So thank you very much to Dr. Fagan, to everyone, to the congregation. I'd like you to connect, and blessings. And I hope to see everyone again at the next anniversary in 290 years.